I'm excited to share with you the Book of Ruth. We've been talking about the judges and that whole historical period in my Bible is History class. And so I wanted to share a little bit about the story. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. It so much pictures the grace of God toward us and the grace that we can extend to each other. So let's talk about it a little bit. Um, the book has a great storyteller. He is concise, he's compact, and he doesn't answer our questions. Like, we might have great moral questions like, why is this suffering happening to this group? Are they being judged because this family left Bethlehem and headed for Moab? Or are they being judged because their sons married Moabite women? And what is their status? Are they followers of God? Are they followers of Marduk? What's happening here? And the author doesn't tell us. He wants us to think through. And before I'm going to judge this family, I got to tell you, when you read the book of Job and you read other things, there are so many more things that are happening in tragedy than simple judgment, that I don't want to play Job's friends with regard to Ruth and to Naomi. So I like the way that this story just begins, and he tells a story and he makes no moral judgments, but he displays the morality of the judges period that is good, right? You and I would be depressed if at the end of the book of Judges we set it down and said, this is what God's people were like in the Judges period. That would be horrible. But when you read the book of Ruth, you get a new perspective. At least there was some light, some good, some generosity going on in God's people during the time of the Judges. So Moab began with that sin of Lot when he escaped Sodom and Gomorrah with his two daughters. His wife turns into a pillar of salt, and they hide in the caves, and the daughters think they're the only ones left in the world, and they want to raise up children, and they have no more spouses, no more husbands, no more fiancés at least. And so they get their father drunk, and they both sleep with him, and they both father nations, the Ammon and Moab, the Ammonites and the Moabites, and they create for themselves two nations that will stand in the way of Abraham's children in the land of Canaan. So their land actually is on the other side of the Jordan, down toward the southern part of the Dead Sea, and their chief god is Marduk. One of the things when we approach an old book like this, there are lots of cultural customs that are strange to us. And so it's a great glimpse into history to walk in a different world at a different time and to see human beings at their best in the midst of those differences. So we're going to look at the agricultural world and what it means. We're going to look at what we mean by kinsman redeemer and levirate marriage. We'll talk about the city gate and how deals were made in the ancient world. And so let's talk about the history first, before we just sit back and enjoy the story. So the agricultural world was paramount. This meant everything. So most of the gods of Canaan had to do with producing rain and producing fruitfulness of the ground. Baal was the god of rain, Asherah was the god of earth, and together in their intermarriage, it would produce agriculture, fruit for the land. And so you can see you wanted your gods to be lined up. At least that's the way it was in Canaan, because harvest is your annual payday. And think about it, if rainfall or pestilence or hail comes and destroys your crop, you're done for a year. Imagine what that does to you. Or getting rain at the wrong time, rain in the middle of harvest instead of rain when the crops need it. Think about the illustration that we've already seen with regard to Joseph, in which people are moving away from their homes, moving away from where they've been living, to a place where, rumor has it, they might be able to find grain. So this is exactly what Naomi and her family are doing. Rumor has it that Moab perhaps has enough to eat, and so they move there. And then when rumor has it that God has returned his blessing to Bethlehem, Naomi, after all of the things that have happened in her life, chooses to go back. So harvest was incredibly important, and you can imagine the joy that comes from a good harvest and the horror that comes from a bad harvest. In fact, we'll see as we go along in the Old Testament world, one of the horrors that would come is when enemies would come at harvest and gather up everything that you had spent a year producing for you and your family, and they would steal it and take it off, and you hardly had enough to start over again. Oh, and then they would do it again the next year. Do you see the trouble? So harvest, when the harvest is good, it is a time of celebration. Harvest was also built into the law so that it could help to provide for the poor in the land. So the law, like in Deuteronomy 24, provided for a process called gleaning, which means after your reapers had come through, you could come as a poor person, as a stranger, as a foreigner, and gather up what the gleaners may have missed. So you can imagine in your mind and heart workers and particularly landowners who were incredibly generous might leave some space so that others could be fed. People who were very punctilious about their fortunes and they wanted to make every grain count, they would push that law right to the edge, maybe leave a grain or two along the way, but hardly worth gleaning in that field. You can imagine what the temptation would be, especially after a famine, to push that line for gleaning as close to the edge of your property as you can, so that who knows when the next payday is going to come. Do you see it? So the agricultural world, if you could put yourself there for a minute and how everything depends on that harvest. Today farmers have insurance that they pay good money, but it helps to even things out some. In a world like this, payday is a great time for gladness when payday actually comes. So that's the agricultural world. You'll also notice in the Book of Ruth that we have someone called a kinsman redeemer, or in the Hebrew, he is the Goel. He is a next of kin person. He's somebody in your family who is going to watch out for other members in the family. It could be that you have fallen on financial hard times, and since you can't sell your land permanently out of the family possession, you could sell it to a family member with the right to redeem that land again later when maybe you did get on your feet. Also, if your brother married someone and didn't have a child before your brother died, you would marry his spouse in order to raise up an heir for her, and that provides for her and maybe girls in the family. It provides for them a way to be provided for, especially in their old age. It implies a financial and emotional commitment. You can see that'd be hard to make. And you can also see you have a vested interest in who your older brother marries. So there you are. That's the kinsman redeemer. Good for redemption of property, for levirate marriage, and then if someone is wrongfully killed in the family, you read about it earlier, in which there were cities of refuge set up that the kinsman redeemer, the vengeance, he would chase down that person who caused the wrongful death, and it would be eye for eye and tooth for tooth, unless that person got to the city of refuge, and then it could be determined whether this was an intentional murder or whether this was an unintentional death. If it was an unintentional death, the person was safe as long as he stayed in the city until the death of the high priest. So there was a little bit of mercy coming. There was nothing shown to the person who intentionally murdered a family member. The city would put them out, and the kinsman redeemer, the Goel, could have vengeance. So that's the kinsman redeemer. Also, you want to note, as we go through the Book of Ruth, the references to the city gate. The city gate was the place where civic, economic, and legal affairs would take place. You remember it was described when the angels came to see whether or not the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah had risen to the level of judgment. They wanted to stay at the city gate. Lot is described as a person who sits at the gate, which means he has a position of influence. He's one of the elders of the city that is there as witness and as one who does business and helps to lead the city. So to sit at the gate was a position of prominence. And then you remember, of course, the story of the priest of Dan that we just finished. Those of us in the history class reading at the end of the book of Judges, it's just a horrible story. And you read about the priest of Dan coming into the city gate and his prostitute being abused. And, well, that's the other side of the stories from the Judges stage. And then you remember Samson in his fight against the Philistines grabs a hold of the gates of the city and carries them off and carries them up a hill and throws them down. Gates too heavy to move and to put back, leaves that city vulnerable to the encroachment of any number of enemies and bad actors when they have no gates that they can close against the fears in the night. So that's the city gate. The city gate. It's a pretty important place that Boaz is going to go to conduct his business. So let's tell the story, can we? Sit back for a minute. Just listen to the story of Ruth. It begins with a phrase, "in the days when the judges ruled," and we've already talked about how corrupt those days were. Cycles of instability moving from oppression to crying out to God, to deliverance, to peace, to forgetfulness and idolatry, to you see the cycle? And this is the time when Boaz and Ruth live. We see that it's only a couple of generations then from the beginning of the United Kingdom stage, which we'll be describing in a later video. So this is in the days when the judges ruled, and we're introduced to a woman named Naomi, whose family has suffered tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. It starts with a famine, and the father in the family decides to move his wife and move to Moab to look for bread, to find perhaps better circumstances there. And while they're there, their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, find Moabite wives, and they marry Orpah, and they marry Ruth. And then, so the famine, next tragedy is the death of Naomi's husband, then the death of both her children. And so it leaves her destitute. And when she hears the news that there may be deliverance from the famine in Israel, she determines in her heart to return home. Her two daughters-in-law decide they want to go as well. They will stand with her, they will go with her. And she has an interesting description that she uses. She says, what future would you have? I am going to have no family line to provide for me in my old age. Do you want that for yourselves? Because, she says, if you were to claim land of your fathers, I would have to have more children. I would have to have a son today, and then you would have to wait the 20 years or so that it takes that son to grow up to be of marriageable age. And then would you wait that long to marry him, to have children, to provide for yourselves? She says, no, it is more bitter. She calls herself Mara instead of Naomi. It's more bitter for me. So I will go back. I will serve this destitution on my own. Orpah chooses to go back to her family. She's going to start over. She's going to find her economic situation back in the house of her father. But Ruth comes up with a covenant, and it's a truly beautiful covenant that she makes with Ruth. And it's found there in Ruth chapter 1. Let me turn to it real quick. Ruth chapter 1. And just want you to hear the beauty in this covenant. Ruth chapter 1. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Ruth says that our fates in the future are going to be interconnected. You will never be alone. Whatever kind of help I might be able to give you as a foreign daughter-in-law in your land, I will be there to walk with you through whatever our circumstances turned out to be. And you can already see there's not very good circumstances, but Ruth says you will go, and then there is in that covenant, it is a covenant not only to Naomi, but did you hear it? It is a covenant to Naomi's God. Your God will be my God. I don't know if that's the moment in which she chose to trust, or if there was a previous moment, but I love this covenant that she makes as they travel back. When they arrive, it says that it is the beginning, at the end of Ruth chapter 1, the beginning of the barley harvest, which is the first harvest, and the wheat harvest will then follow after that. And so it's the beginnings of proof that the famine is over and that harvest is coming. When we read on, something has to happen in order that Ruth and Naomi have food. And so Ruth offers to go gleaning. She knows of the custom. She heads out to glean, and she stumbles upon the land of Boaz and begins to work to play the role after the reapers have gone by. She's gathering what she can in order to meet the needs of her and of Naomi. And she impresses the foreman of the workers. The foreman watches, and she works steadily, she works hard, and he is impressed. So when Boaz shows up, the foreman is sort of anxious to show to Boaz the commitment of this young foreign woman. So the foreman, when Boaz says, "Who is this young woman?" the foreman is anxious to answer. Now, I got a chance a couple of years ago to write an essay comparing the harvest with Boaz and the sheep shearing, which is kind of like a harvest, with Nabal and his workers. And Nabal, the fool, would never have listened to his foreman to hear about the needs of another person. We see that if he's going to reject David, he's going to reject everybody. All the money that Nabal earns is coming to him. He throws a party fit for a king, right? But Boaz, so grateful that this harvest is now here. You notice he's got a great relationship. I love this. When he shows up, he shouts to his workers, "The Lord bless you." And they respond, "And the Lord bless you." Do you see it? And the foreman feels free. I got to tell Boaz, when he asks about this young woman, I got to give her her background, because this is an incredible young woman that Boaz needs to meet. And I'm thinking that the foreman is thinking Boaz will do something to meet her economic need. He may not know all of the kinsman redeemer aspects that will be coming later, but he feels confident that putting Boaz and Ruth together is going to result in help for Ruth and help for Naomi. It turns out the foreman is exactly right. Boaz turns and gives instructions to Ruth. "Make sure you stay here where safety is. I will instruct my men not to touch you. It could be a dangerous job, this gleaning, depending on whose field and whose workers you are working with. You stay here. My people will protect you." And he tells the workers, "Don't bother her. If she seems to be wandering off the lines that you have left behind and actually starting to reap from fields that part of the field that you haven't drawn from yet, don't mess with her. And in fact, take from what you have already reaped and leave it behind that she might pick it up. And so she's got this huge amount of barley that she has gleaned, more than you could ever glean in a day, to take home to Naomi. And when Naomi sees, she knows somebody has chosen to look with favor on Ruth. Somebody has chosen to help provide for her needs, because on her own she couldn't have gathered that much. And when Ruth tells Naomi the story, Naomi, with a gleam in her eyes, realizes Boaz is one of our kinsman redeemers. So there we are. So she comes up with a plan. She decides that what we need to do is, you go at night, you meet with Boaz alone, and make a marriage proposal. Ask him to fulfill his duty as a Goel, as a kinsman redeemer. And so she goes, and in Near Eastern fashion, she asks that he would spread the corner of his blanket over her. And so Boaz commits to doing that. He tells her to stay the night in order that she would be protected from wandering the night by herself, to leave early in the morning before there's a big rumor. And he gives her gifts to take back. And Naomi sees in those gifts proof that, you know what, he's not going to rest until he gets this situation dealt with. Read a great quote from the Archaeological Study Bible from Zondervan, and it said this: the Goel, at its best, it refers to the next of kin who possesses the right to take upon himself whatever need may have overwhelmed his kinsman. Isn't that beautiful? And that's what Boaz is doing for a stranger, for an alien, for a foreigner in Israel, and her mother-in-law. So let's go on to chapter 4. We got to finish the story, right? You see Boaz showing up at the gates of the city and asking the closer kinsman, would you redeem the land or not? And he says, well, yeah, I will redeem it. And he says, when you redeem it, you have to marry Ruth in order to raise up children for her dead husband, ones that will provide for her need in the future. And he said, then I can't do it because it would mar his inheritance. Perhaps he's married already with a child and sees that if there's more children, it gets divided up more ways. So as soon as he says that I cannot redeem it, you redeem it yourself, Boaz says in public fashion, you can imagine the people coming in and out of the gates stopping in order to hear the business transaction that happens. And Boaz says, today you are witnesses, right? Let me just read it for you here. Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. Oh, I love that. So this is Boaz fulfilling the role of a kinsman redeemer, which is going to take care of the economic and physical needs of Naomi in her old age, and take care of and provide a home for the alien and the stranger Ruth. A beautiful picture at the end of chapter 4 where it begins to talk about how the community celebrates. They first celebrate Boaz as a kinsman redeemer. Man, when this works, it is an amazing picture of self-sacrifice and joy in which the community celebrates. And then, do you hear what they say about Ruth to Naomi? Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. 7 sons would have provided the perfect amount of security for your old age, right? 7 is the number of completeness. If you have 7 sons, there's a good chance you will be taken care of in your old age, because tragedy is not going to happen to all 7, right? And then you notice when they announce the birth of Obed from Ruth, they say Naomi has a son. You see how close the family lines were back then and how the community celebrated what God was doing in and through them. It's a beautiful picture. And now we get a chance to see, perhaps at the end, that there's another hidden reason to tell this story. And perhaps this book was actually written. The events take place in the time of the Judges, but perhaps it was written during the United Kingdom period when David is sitting on the throne. And we realize that David's father is Jesse, whose father is Obed, whose father is Boaz by Ruth. It's an amazing way in which God has folded this alien and stranger into the family line of one day the King of Israel, and even better, the family line of Christ himself. Amazing story. All right, so there's that community blessing, the celebration at the end. It's beautiful. Not only have Naomi's fortunes changed, there's the blessing of children and of a future, and it's going to end even in the lineage of David. Now, a couple things just to say in closing. If you get a chance and you want to hear a really good collection of messages on the Book of Ruth, I haven't heard anything better than John Piper's sermon series called A Sweet and Bitter Providence. I think it's available for download free of charge from desiringgod.org, and it'd be worth checking out. It's really good. And then, if you ever get a chance, if you're ever passing through Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or Branson, Missouri, and if Sight and Sound Theater is doing this particular biblical story, I got a chance to see the Book of Ruth done by them, and it was incredible. So if you're ever in that area and they're doing the Book of Ruth, you got to make sure you check it out. Any of their plays are worth checking out. And then, just to mention it, the comparison of Boaz and Nabal is available. That essay that I mentioned is available in a book that I wrote, and you can pick that book up from Amazon. It's available. So, hope you enjoyed our more extended time, but Ruth is worth waiting on, right? All right, so I'm glad you hung out with us. Thanks.